We're about half a day behind where I would like to have been at this point. And what we need to do today is to continue talking about different types of cities that are present within Europe. Overall, there are five types of cities that are named or are associated with particular regional zones. So there's the British cities. There are cities that are Mediterranean in nature, Central European cities, Nordic cities, and Eastern European cities. And you'll see that these are all shown in terms of where you would expect to see these kinds of cities on this map. We'll start with the British type of city. This city resembles the urban centers of the United States. There's a high rate of owner-occupied housing, which essentially means that people are living in houses that they owned. Detached or semi-detached single-family housing is common, and there's also been a flight to suburbs of the outer ring. Some of that's changing now as people are moving back into city centers as they become more attractive, but overall there has been this same flight of wealth and individuals to the suburbs. Overall, there's an interurban decay. So there's poverty and diminishing services and increasing crime in many city centers associated with the zone of British cities. Less attention is paid in these cities to the preservation of the inner city than other Europeans do. That doesn't mean that there aren't British cities where the inner city has been carefully preserved or is cared for, but it just means that there's a lot of cities throughout the zone of the British cities that don't show a lot of preservation of the inner core. The suburban expansion causes the British city to be less compact. So they're bigger, they spread out more, and so another way that they are more similar to cities in the United States. There's a steep population density gradient that moves from the core of the city to the periphery. So much more populated inner cities and much less populated or much less densely populated peripheries. There's also far more inner city gentrification than there is in American cities, so it's happening more than we see here. Now, if we move across the English Channel onto the continent itself and start thinking about the zone of the Central European city, and you'll notice that all of the places that we're going to be in Europe this summer, Gdansk, Berlin, and Copenhagen, all of them are within this zone of the Central European city. So this is what we're going to see quite a lot of. In these areas, the urban genesis was led by the Germans or the Germanic tribes in the feudal period of the Middle Ages. So historically, there's a strong sense of urban superiority and also a strong anti-rural bias. City governments tend to retain considerable importance. You'll see impressive town halls, and we'll see this in several different places. We'll see it in Copenhagen, where we'll see a very impressive town hall there, and we'll probably see similar types of things like this in both Gdansk and Berlin. There's a great importance that is placed on that pre-industrial core. So, for instance, this is a map that shows war damage to housing and the industrial core of Hamburg in Germany. The destruction was very profound in that old pre-industrial core. But today, if you go to Hamburg, you're not going to find much evidence of it because the Germans were very good about rebuilding their industrial core. A very similar thing is something that you'll see in Gdansk. In Gdansk, the old city center, the pre-industrial core of Gdansk, has been almost completely rebuilt. So everything that we see there that looks old actually probably isn't, because it was all, or much of it was rebuilt. In a similar way, when we go to Malbork and look at the castle there, we can actually see the distinction between the new brick and the old brick on the castle. So the castle itself, there's some amazing pictures there of what the castle looked like shortly after World War II, and you can see how much of that area has been rebuilt. So a very common characteristic of those Central European cities. Suburbanization is also not as strong as we see in Britain. So housing density is kind of intermediate between Britain, which is dominated by the single-family residences, and the apartment houses of Central and Southern Europe. So you'll see a mix of single-family houses intertwined with the apartment complexes. Some Central European cities experienced 50 plus years of communist rule. So, for instance, Gdansk is one of these places, and Eastern Berlin is also part of that area. Budapest, for instance, in Hungary, shows an odd mixture of both Central European and communist patterns. So, this is a stylized representation of Budapest. And you'll see that there is a pre-industrial core surrounded by inner rings and outer rings, where there are intermixing of both the apartment blocks and industrial complexes that were very common in the communist or the socialist cities of far Eastern Europe. The next type of city that is prevalent is the Mediterranean city. These Mediterranean cities are located in the southern part of Europe, and they are characterized by a spontaneity of growth. So not a lot of planning that went into the creation of some of these Mediterranean cities, though not all. They have minimal attention to planning. The Germanic rural-urban dichotomy is missing. So there's not as much of a feeling of we're better than, because we live in the city, we're better than the people that live in the country. There's also less social segregation that occurs in the Mediterranean cities. In many cases, there are squatter slums and low-income apartment high-rises that dominate the peripheries. The central business district, at least in the British or Germanic sense, doesn't really exist. So small shops are located throughout the city instead of there being a concentration of commercial activities located at the center. These are also the most compact of European cities. There's high residential densities and no development of outer rings in these kinds of cities. The high status residence areas are often in the inner ring, and the old walled center is often dominated by things like schools, museums, and churches. The periphery is the most stigmatized, and this is contrasted to the British model. So if you live at the periphery of these Mediterranean cities, that's where you're typically going to find the socioeconomic groups that are less desirable or that are lower down the economic ladder. Then there's the Eastern European city. So this is the fourth of these. The East European city bears the imprint quite strongly of both socialism and communism. So prior to the communist era, the Eastern Europe was weakly urbanized. So the majority of the urbanization has actually occurred during the period of communism at the end of in the middle to the end of the 20th century. The socialist doctrine shaped urban development. So government-controlled urban development, including the supply and demand for housing and land, had no monetary value. This is really different than the other parts of Europe, where land has always had monetary value, and the land value has dictated how cities form. So in the ideal socialist city, there was guaranteed access to services. So for instance, childcare, abundant public green space, equal but rudimentary access to consumer goods, and it created self-sufficient small neighborhoods where people lived, worked, and shopped. And this was essentially forced, and it was allowed to occur because of the lack of valuation of real estate. Many East European cities still reflect these goals, especially in places like Russia, the Ukraine, Belarus, and the Balkans. So the population density remains remarkably high in comparison to other European cities, and the normal gradient of core to periphery is retarded or reversed. Industrial areas are spread evenly throughout cities, and this is due to the absence of land value. You would never find industrial areas located at the central parts of cities where land value was very high. But in Eastern European or socialist cities, that didn't happen. So public mass transit prevails, and we'll talk a lot about mass transit systems in the next couple of days, but public mass transit is phenomenal. So to give you an example of this, in a place like St. Petersburg, the number of subway lines is just absolutely mind-blowing. The same is true in Moscow. So both Moscow and St. Petersburg have some of the most well-developed subway lines in the world. Cars tend to be very much less important than they are in the West. Government buildings are of overwhelming size. So they were built that way to convey the power of the state instead of the individual. And this is, if you imagine what you might think of as a Soviet-era Russian government building, they're just these monolithic concrete blocks. In terms of infrastructure, it is in decay, especially in the post-communist era. So there are places of infrastructure that are in decay. Some of that is coming back as Russia has become much more wealthy, but that wealth is distributed in very distinct ways, and there are huge gaps between the wealthy and the poor. So this map here shows Moscow and parts of the distribution of different types of service sectors within Moscow. The last of the city types that we need to talk about is the Nordic city. Nordic cities are prevalent in Scandinavia and Finland, and more so in Sweden and Norway than you would find in Denmark. So they are more recent in origin. They began to be established in the 1600s and 1700s, essentially during the era of Swedish Empire. The cores of Nordic cities are organized on a grid, so very much like the Roman cities were. So they're organized on a grid. They're also the least compact type of all of the cities in Europe. They have broad streets, there's abundant freestanding single-family housing. They're fairly modest in size. So many Nordic cities have populations that are under about 100,000. There are also, however, many amenities. So museums, sport complexes, hospitals, symphony orchestras, and things like that are very common in Nordic cities. They are some of the most appealing and livable cities in the world. So for instance, places like Copenhagen and Stockholm are extremely expensive towns to live in, some of the most expensive towns in the world to live in. And when we're in Copenhagen, we'll take a look at some of these. You'll have a chance to see some of the very nice neighborhoods there, and we'll also look at some of the neighborhoods that are dominated by other or more high-density apartments. Even in the areas that are less desirable, it's still a really nice place to live because of the services that are provided there. So in addition to the characteristics of individual cities, we also need to talk about urban networks. Now there are relationships that are especially spatial relationships that occur among cities. In the United States, we think about the megalopolis. The megalopolis is the coalescence of urban centers that occurs between places like Boston, New York, and Washington, D.C. So an area along the eastern seaboard of the United States that is continually built up. There are really few European examples of a megalopolis. There are some cases, for instance, Ramstedt, Holland, where there are 7 to 12 million people that exist, or includes a large area, a large number of cities, the Rhine-Ruhr area of Germany, the Flemish Diamond in Belgium, the Lancaster to Yorkshire area in England, and the Donbass region of the eastern Ukraine. So another example here, this isn't a megalopolis, but it shows several different cities in Finland that are clustered together. Here's an example of the Ramstad, Holland area, where this is, you can see several cities that have grown up over time and have begun to coalesce with each other. So some geographers contend that the Ramstad, the Rhine-Ruhr, the Flemish Diamond have all began to coalesce into a single supercity. This is represented here as the urban banana. It is non-continuous, and others have other feelings about whether or not this large area, metropolitan area, is actually exists. Another way to look at this is sort of as service areas of large metropolitan areas. In this case, it looks kind of like a bunch of grapes. Each of these circles represents a single large metropolitan area, and you'll notice that they all tend to be about the same size. Now, the reason for this has to do with something that's called central place theory. To understand the placement of cities and the development of cities of different sizes across the European continent, we need to understand the concept of urban influence zones. So urban influence zones are areas outside of an urban area that are still affected by it. In general, following the first law of geography, things that are closer together are more closely related than things that are further apart. So the influence of a particular city extends beyond its borders, and the distance over which that influence extends is dependent upon the size. In addition, the slope of the line, so how quickly that influence decreases also with distance, also depends on the size of the city. So to give you an example of that, we can think about College Station and how we are still influenced, at least in some ways, by being in the vicinity of a very large city like Houston. So you can easily get Houston newspapers delivered in College Station. There are affiliations in professional sports to teams in Houston, San Antonio, Dallas. They're all there. So the influence of those cities does extend into a town like College Station. This also exists in terms of things like stores that are available. There's a lot of different stores that are available in either Houston or Dallas that just aren't here, but we travel to those locations when we need specialized types of goods. Another similarity has to do with airports. So if you think about where we're flying out of, very few of us are flying out of College Station to go on the trip to Europe. Instead, many are traveling to larger airports like the Houston airport to depart for Europe. One of the ways that we can think about this concept in a more theoretical way is through the idea of a central place. So urban settlements are interrelated, and they're considered to be central places, centers for the distribution of economic goods and services. Now, there are attempts that have been made to explain the size and location of settlements, and in particular, there's central place theory, which was proposed by Christaller. And central place theory is something that I want you to really understand. It's assumed within central place theory that the following things were true. First of all, towns provide the surrounding countryside with fundamental goods, things like groceries and clothing, and this will develop in areas of commercial agriculture. Second, farm population is dispersed in an even pattern. We know that this isn't quite true, but for the sake of argument, we're going to assume that farm population is dispersed in an even pattern. Also, the characteristics of the people in which the central places develop are fairly uniform. So they have similar tastes, demands, and incomes. So each kind of product that is produced within an urban influence zone has its own threshold, or minimum number of consumers that are needed to support its supply. The other assumption that is needed in order for central place theory to work is that consumers will purchase goods and services from the nearest opportunity. So they're going to go to the nearest store to get what they need. The results of this are that business people will divide the area into non-competing markets where each entrepreneur has exclusive rights to the sale of a product. So you're not going to see too many of the same types of retailers in the same places. Another result of this is that there's a series of hexagonal market areas that cover the entire plain that ends up emerging. And a central place exists at the center of each of these hexagonal market areas. So this is a schematic of a series of central places, and you notice here at the beginning, if we just concentrate on the center, we get a hexagonal service area around it, a small hexagonal service area around it. The largest central places will supply all the goods and services the consumers in that area demand and can afford. So the size of the market area of a central place will be proportional to the number of goods and services offered from that central place. And contained within or at the edge of the largest markets and areas for central places serving a smaller population and offering goods and services to them. So here we have one very large center that has a very large area of influence. Within it are several smaller areas that nest within it that each are creating its own service area. There are two big conclusions from this. First is that towns of the same size tend to be evenly spaced. Larger towns will be farther apart than smaller ones. And also, systems of towns are interdependent. If one town is eliminated, the entire system then needs to readjust. The conclusions are generally valid in widely different areas within the commercial world. They're particularly valid in agricultural areas, especially with regard to the size and spacing of cities and towns. It stretches things a bit to get it to work with more industrial areas, but we do still see some of that coming into play. So let's take a look move from this map that is a schematic diagram of central places to the next map, which is a German map showing the sizes of different central places and their distribution within a area of Germany. And you can see there are some large central places here that are fairly evenly spaced, and there's a network of other central places that exist around that. Now, if we go back to the idea of the grape bunch, what we find is that each of these grapes or each of these circles represents a central place. So there's a large central place at the center of it. The bigger the central place, the larger the influence area that it has. We'll see that central places tend to be fairly evenly distributed across the landscape.